Beneath the shadowy oaks of St. Michael's Cemetery in Charleston, South Carolina, lie 9 graves that for generations the city's most powerful families have avoided mentioning. Each headstone bears the name of a wealthy plantation owner, all of whom died between 1851 and 1855. And strangely, the recorded cause was identical: a sudden attack of paralysis, followed by a death that was coldly called a mercy by the medical community of the time. But in 1923, when the cemetery was being renovated, workers discovered something so horrifying that city officials immediately sealed the records from public view. Inside each coffin, the wooden lids were deeply scratched with fingernails, and the bodies lay twisted as if they had struggled desperately in their final moments. What they found next was even more haunting. Under the ancient magnolia tree, people dug up a leather-bound diary, neatly written by a man named Solomon Fairfax. In it, he recounted 4 years of systematic revenge, starting with the screams of one family and ending with 9 powerful men buried alive. Before we delve deeper into the story of Solomon Fairfax, once considered a gentle physician but later Charleston's most sophisticated sower of death, let me pause for a moment. Would you like to join the community of people seeking the truth hidden in history? If so, you can follow and turn on notifications so you don't miss the secrets buried by time. And which state are you listening from? I'd love to know. Because every land has its own forgotten stories. The first entry, dated March 15th, 1851, contained only one sentence, and it explained it all. Today I watched my wife and children burn alive, and I did nothing to stop them. Charleston in the 1850s was considered the jewel of the Southern aristocracy. White columned mansions stood tall on the Cooper River, and families who had built their fortunes on rice and cotton felt confident that their power was eternal. The medical profession, though small, had enormous influence among the wealthy, who were often afflicted with mysterious fevers, sudden weakness, and unexplained paralysis. In 1845, a doctor named Cornelius Hathaway opened a practice on Meeting Street. He quickly became a household name among the upper class thanks to his unusual treatments and secrets that few understood. But the source of Hathaway's success came from a man few people noticed: his assistant, a slave named Solomon Fairfax. Solomon was unlike other slaves. He was bought not to work in the fields, but to serve in medicine. It was said that he had an almost supernatural knowledge of herbs and chemical compounds. Knowledge passed down through generations of his family, who had been physicians on the plantations of Lower Carolina. Tall, with a bright, observant eye that seemed to remember every detail, Solomon was far from the familiar image of a slave laborer. He had learned to read and write while living under his previous master's roof before the law forbade it. Even Dr. Hathaway was amazed by Solomon's knowledge of Latin medicine and came to rely on his ability to prepare medicines and assist in difficult cases. Wealthy patients who initially tolerated Solomon's presence later actively wanted him at their bedsides because of his gentle care and seemingly instinctive understanding of their condition. But Solomon's life was not always confined to the clinic. Before coming to Charleston, for 32 years he lived on Pemberton Plantation, about 15 miles outside the city. There he married a woman named Celia, and they had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl in a humble slave cabin. The master's family allowed this in part because Solomon's medical skills had saved hundreds of lives, both slave and master, during sudden outbreaks of epidemics. Solomon combined African folk remedies from his grandmother with methods he picked up from white doctors who visited the plantation. From snake bites to malaria to tuberculosis, he found ways to alleviate them all. This earned him, despite his humble status, a raw respect in his world. The Petons even let Solomon care for them in times of illness, a rare privilege that showed genuine trust in his talents. But that relative peace ended abruptly in March 1851. Edmund Peton, Solomon's long-serving master, was deeply in debt from gambling. To atone for his downfall, he took the most common course of plantation owners, selling off the people he controlled. Among them were Solomon's wife and 3 children. They were to be separated and sent to different plantations across the state. A cold decision disguised as business necessity, but in reality as cruel as a hurricane, sweeping away an entire family, Solomon pleaded. He promised to work for free for many more years, just so his family could stay together. He offered to work for other plantations himself during the peak season to bring back money to pay off his debts. But Edmund Peton, pressed daily by his creditors, rejected all of this. The Charleston slave market was set for March 14th that year, and nothing could change it. That morning, the sky was grey, and rain drizzled down the Ashley River as if nature itself had a premonition of impending tragedy. In the small cabin, Solomon held his wife and children all night, recording every expression, every breath, because he knew that dawn would bring eternal separation. Celia, his wife of 15 years, remained calm, devoting all her energy to caring for the 3 children. Marcus, the eldest son, 8 years old, was intelligent and curious, always wanting to know about the world outside the plantation. Samuel, 6 years old, gentle and with a healing instinct like his father, often followed Solomon into the woods to find herbs. Grace, only 4, clung to her mother, sensing something terrible was waiting, though her young mind could not yet comprehend it. When the slave traders arrived, Solomon could only watch as his family was loaded onto a wooden cart with 6 other families. The crying, the promises of meeting again in the future, words everyone knew, were only meant to ease the unbearable pain. But the horror did not end there. Halfway to Charleston, the wheels sank into a mud puddle and the cart lurched. In the chaos, Celia was thrown off her feet, her head hitting a sharp rock on the side of the road. Blood gushed out. Solomon, his hands chained, tried to rush forward but was powerless. The traders, fearing the loss of value of their cargo, made a chilling decision: leave Celia by the side of the road as if she were nothing more than a broken record. Solomon screamed and struggled, but the other slaves held him down. They knew that resistance would only bring more punishment for all of them. At the Charleston slave market, the nightmare continued. Before Solomon's eyes, the 3 children were sold to 3 different buyers. Marcus fell into the hands of a Georgetown rice farmer who forced children to work in swampy, alligator-infested fields. Samuel was sold to a Highland cotton farmer, known for exploiting them to death. Grace, too young to work in the fields, was taken to Savannah to be a domestic servant and then disappeared from her father's sight, lost in the vast web of southern slavery. Throughout the scene, Solomon maintained a resigned exterior. He knew that one look, one obvious tear could have dire consequences. But inside, something had broken. The man who had spent his life healing, saving lives, now watched everything he loved destroyed by indifferent cruelty. Shortly afterward, Dr. Hathaway, unaware of the terrible loss Solomon had just suffered, paid a large sum for him, for his medical talent had spread far and wide. Dr. Hathaway had first heard of Solomon through whispers passed among Charleston's medical men, physicians who had once seen the remarkable treatments Solomon performed at the Pemberton plantation. And now, with his own practice growing, the doctor needed someone with rare knowledge of medicinal compounds, someone who could steady his failing hands. So it was that Solomon, torn from everything he loved, was led away from the slave market to begin life as the physician's assistant. Yet before stepping fully into this new existence, he turned back one last time. His eyes lingered on the marketplace where his family had been scattered to the wind, their fates sealed by greed. In that lingering look, something hard and unyielding rooted itself in his chest. Not despair, not rage alone, but a colder resolve, an endless patience. Patience enough to wait, to learn, to one day answer cruelty with a price equal to its weight. That night, in the small attic room above the doctor's office, Solomon lit a single candle. He drew out the leather journal he had hidden carefully through every upheaval. With steady hand, he began to write in the deliberate script he had learned as a child. Today I watched my wife and children burn, and I did nothing to stop it. But I am still alive. I remember every face, every name, every voice that laughed as my world ended. They believe they have broken me. They have only taught me patience. The weeks that followed blurred into quiet routines. By day, Solomon prepared medicines, arranged treatment rooms, and tended to patients with the same competence he had always shown. To all appearances, he was dutiful, calm, accepting. Yet beneath this mask of obedience, he was conducting another study entirely. With every case, every consultation, he gathered knowledge not only of illness and remedy, but of Charleston's wealthiest families. The very pillars of society who moved with ease between church pews and slave auctions. Dr. Hathaway himself, a widower in his 50s with no children, soon leaned heavily upon his new assistant. His arthritis slowed him, made fine movements painful, but Solomon's steady hands never faltered. Soon Solomon was trusted to oversee entire courses of treatment, particularly for chronic ailments that required constant care. Charleston's elite, at first viewing him with that strange blend of casual dismissal and patronizing approval, began to shift in their perception. Solomon's quiet manner, his respectfulness, and above all, his undeniable skill earned him something rare. Patients began to ask for him by name. They spoke of his gentleness, of the uncanny way he seemed to sense their suffering. All the while, Solomon listened. He listened in the drawing rooms of the practice. He listened in whispers traded among slaves who moved through Charleston's grand houses, unseen but watchful. He pieced together the lattice work of wealth and cruelty, tracing it back to the auction block where his family had been torn apart. Edmund Peaton, he discovered, had not acted alone. He had only been one strand in a vast web of commerce and complicity. The Charleston slave market was not some hidden vice. It was the engine that ran on the very breath of the city's most esteemed men, who presided over churches and charities by day, yet financed and profited from the trade in human flesh by night. Men who recited philosophy at polished tables even as their wealth rested upon chains and broken homes. From among Dr. Hathaway's regular patients, Solomon quietly marked 9 names. 9 men who had stood at the market. 9 men who had raised hands to bid or lent money to the dealers or purchased children with the same detachment they might show when selecting cattle. 9 men whose lives would soon become the focus of Solomon's patient, deliberate study. And as 1851 slipped into 1852, Solomon began what he called in secret his education in advanced chemistry. Dr. Hathaway's medical library held texts that few in Charleston had ever touched, works describing substances capable of strange effects, paralysis that left the mind awake, compounds that induced unconsciousness without ending life, powders that mimicked death itself while leaving the victim trapped inside the unmoving body. Those medical tomes, meant to teach and to cure, became for Solomon the textbooks of a darker curriculum. He read them as a student might pore over a syllabus, not for diplomas, but for a kind of retribution. The most terrible lesson he found was hidden in a treatise on South American plant toxins, a vine from the Amazon, cultivated now in the greenhouses of collectors, produced a compound with an almost unfathomable effect. Properly prepared, it could still the muscles completely while leaving the mind painfully awake. To an untrained observer, the victim appeared dead, utterly motionless, breath shallow or halted, and yet would remain conscious long enough to feel, to understand, to suffer. Months passed as Solomon hunted down the living specimen. He traced it to the greenhouse of Professor Nathaniel Crenshaw, a naturalist at the College of Charleston, who collected strange plants for the pleasure of study. Crenshaw, delighted to find a kindred spirit, welcomed Solomon's help among his pots and glass panes. No one suspected the precise nature of Solomon's curiosity. He tended the vines, learned their moods, learned when and how they stunted or flourished. By night, in the small shed behind the practice where he claimed to prepare harmless herbal tonics for Dr. Hathaway, Solomon carried out experiments that the textbooks had only hinted at. With laboratory mice, he mapped doses as a musician might map notes too little, and the effect was merely weakness. Too much and life ended at once. Between those extremes lay the narrow, terrible range. He sought a quantity that would still every muscle mimic death to any glance, yet leave the mind inside the body, awake to the slow closing of the world. Can you imagine the patience that task required? The steady hand needed to measure an amount that balanced life and a living nightmare. But chemistry alone would not complete what Solomon intended. He had to become someone the city trusted, a fixture rather than a curiosity. So he buried himself in work. He arrived earlier to the office, stayed later to organize supplies, and took on responsibilities that made Dr. Hathaway lean on him more and more. The doctor's arthritic hands complained. Solomon's did not. Patient after patient came to trust him. Appointments were left in his charge. It was the slow accretion of authority, invisible at first, then undeniable. And while he cultivated trust, Solomon cultivated his list. By winter of 1852, he had chosen his first mark, Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick, a rice planter, whose laughter at the auction had sliced the air as casually as a blade. Fitzpatrick had joked about the breeding potential of the children on the block, words Solomon would not forget. The colonel suffered from chronic gout. His pattern of monthly visits, his solitary arrivals, his steady reliance on the practice's care made him an ideal first patient. In the leather journal Solomon kept by candlelight, each intended victim became a case file. He recorded ailments, appointments, the rhythms of each man's life, who dined with whom, who lent money to the traders, who had bid on the children, that tore Solomon's family apart. The entries read like clinical notes at first glance, but the purpose behind them was not to heal. Each line was a plan. Each appointment, a small window of opportunity. So the year of preparation stretched on. Every detail was rehearsed in his mind: how to prepare the toxin without drawing notice, how to carry it into the presence of a man who thought himself untouchable, how to make the symptom look natural to a city full of physicians. Solomon understood with a patient's cold clarity that the men he targeted were not isolated beasts, but pillars of society. Men whose deaths would be dissected by the very community he lived within. If anything went wrong, suspicion would fall hard and fast, and the delicate design would collapse. And so he waited. He watched. He measured. The greenhouse vines curled under his care, the mice taught him his margins, and the journal recorded his slow, steady descent from healer to calculating architect of terror. Would you imagine a man who once reached to soothe a fever could plan such a thing? The answer, Solomon believed, lived not in sudden fury, but in the long, cold arithmetic of patience. The work itself was perilous. More than once, Solomon brushed too close to his own creation, the toxin seeping against his skin, numbing his limbs, in a way that gave him a chilling preview of what his chosen men would endure. Each accidental taste of paralysis reminded him how thin the line was between mastery and destruction. Yet, with each misstep, his understanding grew sharper, steadier. In its final form, the compound was a perfect deception, colorless without scent, invisible to eye or nose. A liquid that could be folded into ordinary medicine without the faintest trace. Once swallowed, it began its silent work. Within half an hour, the patient would weaken as though their own ailments had worsened. Within an hour, the body would surrender to complete stillness. No muscle could move, no tongue could speak, though the mind remained awake, terrifyingly awake. And in that cruel state, to anyone without modern instruments, the victim would appear dead. Physicians of the 1850s would listen for breath, would feel for a pulse, and finding nothing, would assume the patient had passed peacefully. Only one who knew the secret of the vine could read the faint signs of life that trembled just beneath the surface. Solomon alone knew. Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick became the first name Solomon placed beneath his steady hand. The choice was both practical and bitterly personal. Fitzpatrick came to the practice each month complaining of gout, trusting Solomon as if he were a fixture of his routine. He was arrogant, cruel, and most of all, he lived without close kin, surrounded only by enslaved servants, too frightened to question his sudden passing. If he fell, the world would not linger long upon him, and there was his heart, a weak one, well documented by Dr. Hathaway. If it stopped, no one would think twice. It was the perfect mask for what was about to unfold. December 15th, 1852. The colonel arrived irritable and limping, demanding relief. Dr. Hathaway was busy in another chamber, and so he asked Solomon to tend to the colonel alone. Fate had opened the door. As he measured the familiar treatment, Solomon's hands remained as calm and precise as they had been through years of practice. This time, though, a few measured drops of the paralytic fell into the mixture. His face revealed nothing as he carried the cup to Fitzpatrick. The colonel drank without hesitation, as he always had. What followed imprinted itself into Solomon's memory forever. As the poison crept its way inward, Fitzpatrick complained of weakness, of sudden fatigue. Solomon sat beside him, his voice quiet, almost soothing. "Colonel Fitzpatrick," he said softly, "my name is Solomon Fairfax, and you destroyed my family. You laughed as my children were sold on the 14th of March 1851. You joked about the value as breeding stock. Do you remember that day?" The colonel's eyes, growing glassy with paralysis, flickered. For the first time, arrogance fell away. Horror took its place. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came. Already, his voice was gone. "You're not dying yet." Solomon continued as calmly as if discussing a treatment. "The medicine I gave you has stilled every muscle. But your mind is clear. You can hear me, see me, feel everything. In an hour, Dr. Hathaway will come in and believe you are dead of heart failure. Your body will be taken away, and tomorrow evening, you will be lowered into St. Michael's Cemetery." Solomon leaned closer so the colonel's fading vision could hold his face. "But you won't die. Not at first. You'll be awake as they hammer the coffin shut, as they shovel dirt above you. You will have hours to think, hours to remember, my children, hours to understand what terror really feels like." The colonel's body sagged, lifeless to the eye, but his gaze, wild, desperate, betrayed the truth he was trapped inside. Solomon checked his pulse, checked his breath, just as any physician would, and confirmed what others would not notice. So faint, so hidden, yet not gone. When Dr. Hathaway entered minutes later, Solomon was already standing at the man's side, his expression one of quiet grief. "I'm afraid the colonel has passed," Dr. Solomon said with practiced calm. His heart gave out as I prepared his treatment. He seemed to go very peacefully. The doctor, after a brief and solemn examination, agreed. The cause was clear. A frail heart had finally failed. Within an hour, the colonel's body was carried to his grand home. Arrangements were made for a funeral befitting one of Charleston's most prominent men, and Solomon was there at the burial, standing in the segregated section for enslaved mourners, watching as the coffin was lowered. He heard the earth strike wood, and he wondered, not with triumph, but with a cold, steady certainty, was Fitzpatrick still awake? Could he still hear? Could he still feel? That night, Solomon opened his leather journal and wrote the words that would carry him forward. "Colonel Fitzpatrick has paid for his crimes. 8 more remain. Justice is patient, but it is also certain." The months after Colonel Fitzpatrick's burial moved with an almost unbearable slowness. Each day stretched like a thread, taut with the fear that someone, anyone, might raise a question. Yet Charleston's voices carried only the expected murmurings, polite condolences, wistful recollections of the colonel's service to community and country. Dr. Hathaway himself spoke of the death in hushed tones among fellow physicians, noting it as proof of how suddenly a heart could fail even in men who seemed outwardly strong. No suspicion drifted toward Solomon. His name, if mentioned at all, was spoken with respect for his careful hands, his gentle manner, his quiet skill. The mask held, and because the mask held, Solomon knew his path was clear to continue. But inside, something unexpected stirred. It was not remorse. No, Solomon's cause remained as certain as the beating of his own heart. Yet the memory of Fitzpatrick's final hours, silent and helpless beneath the earth, would not release him. He imagined the panic, the desperate awareness in the dark, the scratching futility of a mind trapped in a still body. For weeks, sleep would not come. Not out of guilt, but because his imagination refused to stop replaying what the colonel must have endured. When the time came to choose his second victim, Solomon chose with care. Judge Marcus Calverton. The man had stood not only as a witness when Solomon's family was torn apart, but as a voice of legal sanction. From the bench, he had argued that separating families was essential necessary. He had claimed for maintaining order, for preserving profit. He had placed the weight of the law behind the destruction of countless lives, including Solomon's own. And now, at the age when time had already weakened him, Calverton suffered from crushing migraines, his skull splitting with pain that grew worse each year. These visits to Dr. Hathaway's office grew frequent, desperate. For Solomon, they offered opportunity cloaked in medical plausibility. A stroke could claim any man under such strain. And at Calverton's age, no physician would doubt the cause. Yet fate in March of 1853 complicated the plan. Dr. Hathaway announced that he was considering a partner, a young physician named Timothy Henderson. Newly returned from Philadelphia, brimming with modern training, Henderson carried knowledge that Charleston's elder doctors did not. He had studied under men who were beginning to see deeper, who whispered of forensic medicine and of new ways to search for poison in the dead. Solomon understood immediately his carefully measured patience was no longer safe. If Henderson joined the practice, his work would be exposed to sharper eyes, to hands eager to test new methods. If he was to complete his mission, it must be done swiftly, within months, not years. The rhythm of patience was broken. Now, there was only urgency, and urgency invited error. In April of 1853, Solomon prepared Calverton's usual treatment. The dosage, so precise, so rehearsed, slipped. Just slightly. Enough that the toxin took hold with unusual force. Calverton's body collapsed more quickly than expected. His stillness too complete. His eyes, wide and frozen, seemed to scream, though no sound emerged. Dr. Hathaway noticed. Strange, the physician murmured as he bent over the corpse. The rigidity, more than I would expect from a stroke. And these eyes. There's something desperate in them. Solomon's heart pounded in his chest. Each second stretched into eternity as the doctor examined further. What if he saw? What if in this moment, years of secrecy dissolved under a single damning realization? But knowledge in 1853 was not yet ready to unmask him. After long minutes, Dr. Hathaway straightened and sighed. Poor man, he said gently. His end must have been terribly painful. The stroke was unusually severe. He could not know how precise his words were. For Judge Calverton, paralyzed, but away, was indeed suffering in silence as his body was prepared for burial. The funeral that followed was grander than Fitzpatrick's. 3 decades on the bench had earned Calverton the attendance of Charleston's elite. Again, Solomon stood apart among the enslaved mourners, watching another coffin sink into the earth. This time only 3 rows from where the colonel lay. But as the last prayers were spoken, Solomon's attention drifted to the back of the crowd. A young man stood there, not weeping, not solemn, but writing. carefully, deliberately into a small leather-bound book. Each motion precise as though recording not grief, but evidence. And in that moment, a chill coiled around Solomon's spine. The man with the little leather notebook, it turned out, was Thomas Grimby, a reporter for the Charleston Mercury. Grimby had begun to stitch together a pattern he called in private notes. The prominent deaths phenomenon, a cluster of sudden fatalities among Charleston's leading men that taken one by one could be explained away, but taken together felt like something else entirely. Over 6 months he had watched the city lose notable citizens to unexpected medical calamities, all neatly plausible on their face, all oddly frequent for such a short span of time. That night, Solomon's journal held a line edged with worry. Judge Calverton has joined Colonel Fitzpatrick in receiving true justice. But the eye of men is waking. I must move faster even if the risks grow. Time was slipping. So Solomon shortened the clock he had once intended to measure in years into mere months. His third choice was Captain William Dandridge, a man whose hands had loaded human lives onto ships and whose ledger balanced bodies beside bales of cotton. Dandridge was not a chronic patient the way Fitzpatrick and Calverton had been. He was generally hail-touched only occasionally by minor injuries from his work at sea. To strike him, Solomon would have to make his own opening. Charleston's slave quarters in their grim economy carried their own invisible communications. The cooks who worked in the great houses spoke to one another. They carried scraps of news and the small arrangements that made large gatherings possible. From those whispers, Solomon learned that Captain Dandridge would host a dinner on May 20th, 1853, a gathering of the shipping community to toast new routes and discuss new profits. It was the perfect opportunity. Men gathered wine. Flowing attention diverted a chance to move among them unseen. He arranged his place through Martha, an elderly woman who oversaw kitchen operations for the city's grand events. Martha, who knew the pulse of service and the value of a steady hand, welcomed the help several of her usual assistants had been felled by a fever sweeping the French quarters. She had no inkling of what a man she knew as a healer had in mind. On the evening itself, the Dandridge dining room flashed with crystal and silver. Charleston's maritime elite sat shoulder to shoulder, voices bright with plans for expansion and arithmetic about the profitability of human cargo. Solomon moved among them like a shadow with a purpose, filling goblets and smoothing linens while he listened. The stories the men told were ordinary. To them, voyages, market strategies, the efficiencies of packing and transport. To Solomon, each anecdote was proof of how intimately their wealth was entwined with the suffering of others. Captain Dandridge presided over the table with the tacit authority of a man who had seen the world's edges, weathered hands, a booming laugh, and a knowledge of how to keep captives docile during long crossings, all of which made him a man Solomon could not forgive. As the night unfurled, Solomon watched and catalogued. He noted manners, seating arrangements, who poured wine for whom, which men spoke loudest about the human cargo trade. In the spaces between courses, he learned names he hadn't yet written in his ledger of retribution. And yet, even as he wove among the plates and decanters, Thomas Grimby's investigations tugged at the edges of the web Solomon had spun. Grimby had begun to visit St. Michael's regularly, mapping graves, cross-referencing obituaries, and assembling the thin threads that might reveal a pattern. What the reporter was about to discover would press upon Solomon's careful plans like a hand closing around a map. If this story sends a shiver down your spine, perhaps share it with someone who loves the slow burn of history's darker turns. And tell me, have you ever felt a cluster of strange events and wondered if they were connected? I always love hearing where you listen from and what unsettles you most about these buried stories. The evening at Dandridge's would mark in Solomon's private reckoning the beginning of the end. It was a night that would bring more than one secret into the open. The secret of how the elite lived unseen by consequence, and the secret of a healer who had become the instrument of a patience turned savage. What Solomon heard that night confirmed his worst suspicions. The trade in human lives was not the work of isolated men, but a woven network of complicity. Around the oak table they spoke of people with the same detached calculus they used when bargaining over cotton, of freight families reduced to ledger entries suffering disgust as an acceptable cost of commerce. Each anecdote tightened the rope of proof in Solomon's mind. His chance came with the dessert. The final course, a rich, brandy-soaked cake, required careful preparation for each plate. Working in Captain Dandridge's busy kitchen, Solomon slipped the paralytic into the captain's portion with the practiced precision of a man who had measured grief and pity in equal parts for months. The compound dissolved into the alcohol, its taste hidden, its absorption swift. Dandridge ate with pleasure, praised Martha's cooking, even asked for the recipe, oblivious to what had been folded into his spoon. Within half an hour, the first symptoms surfaced. Dizziness, a pallor the men dismissed as the after effect of wine and warmth. The captain excused himself for air and steadied his steps toward the study. There he sank into his leather chair. The toxin finished its work. But this outcome was not what Solomon had planned. Instead of dying alone in the hush of Dr. Hathaway's office, Captain Dandridge fell before a dozen witnesses collapsing in the private study of his home. The spectacle summoned immediate alarm. Dr. Samuel Pettigrew, one of the guests, hurried to examine him. Most peculiar, he said, frowning as he felt the stiffness in the body. There are no signs of apoplexy or heart failure. The rigidity is pronounced almost as if he had been poisoned. That single word, poison, spread through the room like a cold wind. Questions flared. Within an hour more, physicians had been summoned. By morning, the rumor had threaded through Charleston like a needle drawing taut another prominent man dead under suspicious circumstances. Thomas Grimby arrived before dawn, notebook in hand, interviewing servants and guests while shock was still fresh. He learned, among other things, that Solomon had been present that night, moving between tables, refilling goblets, a familiar face amidst the company. For the first time, someone could place a single individual at more than one scene. The net, which had been only a concept in Solomon's journal, began to tighten in the waking world. Yet, 6 of his intended names remained unchecked. The glare of suspicion made the familiar methods dangerous. Time, which had once bent pliantly to his will, now pressed in from all sides. And so, Solomon took the most terrible leap of all. If he could no longer pick them off one by one, he would strike many at once. He found his moment in a private meeting scheduled for June 15, 1853. 6 of Charleston's leading slave traders had arranged to gather at Henderson and Associates after hours to finalize a plan that would spread their operations even further. The office, lit by gas lamps supplied from a central line, would be quiet and closed to the public a small confined space where a single action might reach them all. The idea that formed in Solomon's mind was as simple as it was monstrous. Over 2 weeks working at night and using his access to the practice's stores, he concentrated his paralytic into a potent form. Rather than smuggling doses into cups or cakes, he would introduce the toxin into the very air these men would breathe. The Henderson Building's gas distribution offered the means a central line feeding lamps across the structure. If he could inject his compound into that supply, the lamplight would carry with it the poison, an invisible fog that would still every muscle once the lamps were lit. On the appointed evening, Solomon waited in the alley behind Henderson and Associates. At 8, the windows glowed with gaslight. He watched the light bloom, and in his chest, the years of planning tightened into a single, precise motion. Within 30 minutes, the building fell silent. Solomon stayed another hour, ensuring the paralysis had fully taken hold, and then used a duplication of the rear key, acquired by long patience and small favors, to slip inside. The conference room was a still life of horror. 6 men were frozen in their chairs, hands on papers, faces locked in whatever expression they had worn when breath betrayed them. Their eyes, the last organs free to move, followed Solomon as he crossed the room. Terror flickered there, wide, frantic proof that the bodies were instruments of a mind imprisoned by stillness. He walked among them with the same soft voice he had used before, clinical and composed. One by one, he named himself. He told them plainly and without flourish what he had done. He explained that their muscles had been stilled, their minds left alert, that when the city pronounced them dead, their bodies would be prepared for burial and their coffins lowered into the ground. He painted the hours to come in quiet, surgical detail. The hammering, the shoveling, the slow darkness, and promised they would have every moment to think about what they had done to other people's children. Imagine the steadiness required to deliver such words, the cold patience it took to translate grief into procedure. Solomon's handwriting later recorded each phase, each reaction. Yet even in that room of frozen men, he felt the world begin to tilt. The very scale of his act, attacking 6 at once in a public building, would be noticed. And the more bodies he piled into the earth, the louder the questions would grow above ground. The look in their eyes, panic, braided with disbelief. The frantic attempts to communicate was more than Solomon had imagined. It delivered a satisfaction that decades of planning had not taught him to expect proof that his craft had worked, that the men who had treated human life as ledgers now lay trapped within their own bodies. For a single silent instant, his patience felt vindicated. But triumph is a fragile thing. As Solomon moved to leave the building and let dawn find them, he heard footsteps in the corridor, footsteps that had not been part of his careful tally. The door swung inward, and there stood Thomas Grimby, the journalist whose small leather notebook had become an unwelcome shadow in Solomon's days. Grimby had followed threads of rumor and timing to this very meeting. He stared at the frozen men, then at Solomon. "So it's true," Grimby said, softly voice threaded with both horror and a slow, terrible vindication. "Someone has been systematically killing Charleston's elite. It's you." In that moment, the architecture of Solomon's secrecy collapsed. There could be no plausible explanation for his presence among 6 motionless bodies, no convenient alibi that would not snap under scrutiny. The signs all pointed the same way: a hand skilled in medicine knowledge of schedules and the means to bend a city's trust to deadly ends. Solomon did not attempt to deny it. "They destroyed my family," he answered, voice even. He did not plead or flinch. "They sold my children like cattle. They left my wife to die in the road. This is not murder. This is justice." Grimby's face held a complexity that a simple arrest would not untangle. As a reporter, he was sworn to unmask truth. As a Southerner, he was steeped in the systems that had created the very grievance Solomon invoked. The conflict twisted him for a beat, a private reckoning that would shape the choice he made next. "You realize," Grimby said, nodding toward the men who could do nothing but look. "They're still alive. Their eyes move. You've made them appear dead while their minds remain aware." Solomon nodded. "They will feel the same terror my children felt on the road to the market. They will have hours to think." Their exchange, Grimby later recorded, shows how closely mercy and judgment sat together that night. The journalist's notes, unearthed decades later, would preserve the nuance: a man of the press confronting a man shaped by injustice, both recognizing the truth but coming to different conclusions about what must follow. Outside voices approached investigators, perhaps colleagues of the men who had been expected at the meeting, or servants alarmed by the sudden stillness. Panic pressed in. Both men knew the scene would be discovered within minutes. Grimby, torn and deliberate, offered a narrow human mercy. "There's a back staircase," he whispered. "You could go. I could hold back my report for a few hours, give you a head start." But Solomon had already made his choice. The years of planning had not been made to end with escape. 9 men had shaped the fate of his family. He had felled 6. To run would leave 3 to continue in their cruelty, leaving the law, the very law that had failed him, intact. "I will not run," he said, voice steady as any professional pronouncement. "Let them come. Let them see what I have done. Perhaps then, when the story spreads, anyone will understand. We have limits to the silence imposed upon us." And with that, the alley filled with approaching footsteps and the dark, patient plan that had unfolded for 4 years met the sudden bright scrutiny of the world above. The footsteps outside grew louder, voices threading together until they became a single approaching tide. In that instant, Thomas Grimby made a decision that would sit with him for the rest of his life. He chose the story. He chose the notebook and the witness over the man who had confessed in the shadowed room. Quietly, almost reluctantly, he positioned himself where he could watch and record everything that followed, ensuring a full account of what the constables would find and what would be said that night. When Charleston's officers burst into the conference room, the sight that met them was one their training could not neatly explain. 6 of the city's most prominent citizens sat frozen around a polished table, faces, slack eyes, wide and strangely alive. And standing at the center of that impossible tableau was a slave who did not run. Solomon Fairfax made no flight. He made no frantic resistance. He stood collected and offered the constables a confession as precise and unflinching as an autopsy. The chief constable recorded his words, and those pages later found their way into Charleston's criminal records. Solomon described step by step the compound, the way he had prepared it, how he had delivered it, his selection of men, their ties to the slave trade, the cold arithmetic by which he had chosen his hours. His confession solved not only the evening's carnage, but also the other sudden deaths that had for nearly 2 years puzzled physicians and unsettled social circles. The paralysis, the method, the motive, everything was laid bare with the same meticulous hand that had written his journal for 4 years. What followed was one of Charleston's most contentious trials of the antebellum era. The question the city could not evade was not only whether Solomon was guilty. His confession left little room for doubt, but what to make of the reasons he gave. The prosecution led by District Attorney Charles Rutledge painted a straightforward picture, a slave who had murdered 9 men and therefore deserved the severest punishment. Order had to be maintained. Society required it. The court-appointed defense attorney Benjamin Crawford faced an impossible task that was not entirely legal in nature. Instead of denying Solomon's acts, Crawford chose to hold up a mirror one Charleston preferred to keep shaded. He forced the trial to look not only at the killings, but at the world that had made them imaginable. Testimony peeled back practices the city cherished in polite conversation. The routine of auctions that severed families, the casual cruelty of treating people as commodities, the law's helplessness to protect those without legal standing. The courtroom became unwillingly a place where the public could see the human consequences of the slave economy. Grimby's dispatches for the Charleston Mercury turned the trial into a sensation that spread beyond the city. He published long excerpts from Solomon's journal, careful descriptions of the paralytic substance, and eyewitness accounts that stirred readers from Virginia to Louisiana. The tale of a healer who had turned his knowledge into revenge fascinated and horrified plantation households across the region. Owners read the descriptions with a tremor pride perhaps, but also fear at the thought that the supposed inferiority of the enslaved had been disproved by the very science they once tried to deny them. The medical community too could not ignore the case. Dr. Hathaway, shattered by the betrayal of a man he had trusted and relied upon, took the stand. He testified about Solomon's access to exotic botanical specimens, about the assistant's deft chemistry and steady hands. His testimony carried an uneasy implication that slaves, when given the means or the opportunity, could possess knowledge as exacting as any white physicians. Arguments rose in salons and journals about whether educating enslaved people was wise or dangerous. The debate disguised a deeper panic. An economic order built on ignorance and control now confronted proof that its foundations could be studied, and if so wished, used. Perhaps the most wrenching moments of the trial were the testimonies of the men who had been robbed of movement, but not of awareness. Those paralyzed in the Henderson and Associates conference room were in a sense witnesses twice over. They had felt the halt of their bodies, and then the long hours when others spoke of their deaths and made burial plans. Their memories of helplessness translated into testimony that no legal brief could erase. Each account gave the jurors and the public a glimpse of the private terror Solomon had insisted his victims should taste. Colonel Harrison Vance described it with a voice that still trembled when recounting the memory. He could hear everything, feel everything, but could not move an eyelid. His wife wept over him while plans for his burial were spoken aloud. He wanted desperately to tell her he was there to reach for her hand, to reassure her, but he was a prisoner inside his body. If Solomon Fairfax meant to teach me what terror was, Vance said he succeeded beyond measure. His words landed in the court like a heavy stone, and in that silence, the city heard a measure of what Solomon claimed to have intended. The verdict, when it came, was swift. The law moved as the legal machine always does toward order, toward a conclusion that would quiet the streets and reassure property holders. But the case did not die with Solomon. It lingered in conversations, in editorials, in the worried whispers of men who had until then assumed their control absolute, and Grimby's notebooks. Those careful, aching pages continued to travel beyond Charleston. For years, newspapers reprinted his accounts. For years, people argued about what the trial had really been about. Was it a simple matter of crime and punishment? Or was it, as some readers now claimed, an indictment of a system that made such violence inevitable? The city returned slowly to its rhythms. But for those who looked, who read the newspapers, who walked by St. Michael's in the quiet hours, the memory of Solomon Fairfax remained. Not simply as a murderer, but as a man, shaped by a world that had offered him no lawful recourse and who, in taking justice into his own hands, forced the entire community to look at what it had been willing to let stand. The revelation that 3 of Solomon's earlier victims, Colonel Fitzpatrick, Judge Calverton, and Captain Dandridge, had been lowered into the earth, still breathing, their bodies alive, though trapped, caused a public outcry that spread far beyond Charleston's boundaries. Families across the South began to ask uneasy questions. Had their own departed truly died of natural causes, or had they too been claimed by an unseen hand, silenced by poison buried while their hearts still beat? Exhumations multiplied. Physicians found themselves besieged with requests for post-mortems, for answers, for reassurance. The medical community, overwhelmed, could not keep pace with the tide of suspicion. And for years afterward, Charleston carried an air of unease, as though the ground itself might still be hiding restless voices. Through it all, Solomon remained calm. He spoke clearly without trembling, without regret, except to say that he had failed to finish his mission. 6 of 9, not 9 of 9. That was the only sorrow he admitted. His final statement to the court was written down, preserved and read in whispers. Long after the trial, I was trained to preserve life and ease suffering. But when this society destroyed my family and called it lawful, I learned that the same knowledge used to heal could also be used to ensure justice. I do not ask for mercy. None was shown to my wife or my children. I ask only that when you condemn me, you remember I did not create the system that makes such vengeance necessary. The jury needed less than an hour. The verdict guilty on all counts, death by hanging, surprised no one. In a slave-holding city, order had to be maintained. Yet, the speed of the conviction did not quiet the questions his story left behind. On October 15, 1853, before a crowd of more than 2,000 onlookers, Solomon Fairfax met his fate. He climbed the scaffold with the same steady composure that had marked his trial, and his final words, carried by Thomas Grimby to newspapers throughout the South, echoed like a curse over the crowd. I die knowing that 9 men felt the terror my children felt when they were sold away. That makes my death worthwhile. But this system will go on. Other families will be torn apart. And when that happens, remember, even the most patient man has limits to what he will endure in silence. His body was cast into an unmarked grave outside the city. for the law forbade executed criminals from resting in consecrated ground. Yet Solomon's voice did not end there. His journal, taken as evidence, never returned to the court archives. Grimby, allowed to study its pages during the trial, copied it word for word before returning the original. Years later, in 1889, when Grimby prepared his memoirs, he confessed a choice of his own. He could not bring himself to destroy Solomon's words, yet feared to release them. And so, beneath the wide branches of the magnolia tree in St. Michael's Cemetery, beside the men Solomon had destroyed, he buried the journal in the soil. In his memoirs, he wrote, "I could not bear to destroy the record of such methodical revenge, but I could not risk it inspiring another hand. Perhaps in the future, with different eyes, the necessity that drove Solomon Fairfax to become both healer and killer will be understood." And indeed, in 1923, during a cemetery renovation, the journal was unearthed again. Alongside it came evidence no one had wanted to believe: 9 coffins opened, revealing scratch marks etched from within. Fingernails clawing at wood. Proof that Grimby's account had not exaggerated, not invented, but recorded with brutal accuracy the fate of Solomon's victims. The city sealed the findings. Officials declared the records too dangerous, citing fears of unrest, whispers of racial tension. But many suspected another reason, that the revelations threatened the reputations of families still proud of names once tied to the trade in human lives. And yet, Solomon's shadow spread. Slaveholders throughout the South became wary of education, particularly when it brushed against medicine chemistry or the mysteries of plants. New laws tightened chains around knowledge, forbidding books, training even scraps of scientific instruction. They had learned too late that knowledge could turn against its masters. His case, meanwhile, shaped the birth of forensic medicine in America. The strange paralytic he had used prompted scientists to study toxins, to refine the art of the post-mortem, to peer more carefully into the secrets of sudden death. From one man's vengeance came advances that echoed into future investigations. But perhaps Solomon's deepest legacy lay in the debate his story stirred. For if a man like Solomon, trusted, educated, seemingly loyal, could harbor such silent fury for years, what did that mean for the millions who had never spoken their pain aloud? His story exposed a truth plantation society wished to forget, that beneath the mask of obedience lay the weight of unbearable loss. And so the tale of Solomon Fairfax remains suspended between justice and horror, compassion and dread. Was he avenger or murderer, healer or executioner? What truly do we call a man driven to create his own justice when every door of law is closed against him? Tell me, what do you think? Was Solomon's vengeance a dark mirror held up to a darker system? Or was it simply another cruelty born of grief? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this story has carried you through Charleston's haunted past, remember to subscribe, tap the bell, and share this tale with someone who seeks the hidden histories that were never meant to be remembered. Until we meet again, remember the past is never buried. It waits patiently beneath the earth for those willing to dig.